In an era defined by the return of great power competition, sea power has again moved to the center of statecraft. States can negotiate on land and contest at forums, but at sea they communicate in a language older than treaties, the deliberate movement of armed ships under sovereign authority. Modern navies do not sail carrier strike groups for spectacle, they do so to shape the geometry of deterrence before any shot is fired. Across the North Atlantic and its adjoining corridors, this reality has become visible as powers measure one another not by statements, but by presence, posture, and endurance. It is within that pattern, naval presence as geopolitical communication, that the scene aboard the USS George H. Bush must be understood. The carrier that day was not merely a floating runway, but a stage of strategic messaging. Donald J. Trump, serving as President of the United States, did not simply tour a ship, he stood on the apex symbol of American expeditionary reach, turning hardware into narrative. The event was not built for sailors alone, nor for domestic spectators. It was constructed for analysts and rivals capable of reading what it means when the head of state reviews combat-credible power offshore. A carrier does not exist to float, it exists to alter calculations. Its aircraft, escorts, command architecture, and endurance all are instruments of persuasion that operate upstream of conflict. When a president stands on such a deck, the vessel ceases to be merely military hardware and becomes a diplomatic broadcast. This state retains the reach, the means, and the will to project power far from home. No press briefing can replicate the gravity of that image. The USS George H. Bush, as flagship of Carrier Strike Group 10, embodies a doctrine, deterrence through credibility. Aircraft are not staged for display, but for immediate tasking. The escorts, destroyers, logistics vessels, command support show the carrier is not a lone icon, but a living organism inside an integrated kill chain. When that system is reviewed by the head of state, the act plays two directions at once: inward for morale and discipline, outward for strategic interpretation. What looks ceremonial on camera is procedural in deterrence logic, a reaffirmation that naval force remains a primary channel through which the United States communicates intent. A presidential review of forces is never a courtesy visit. It is a constitutional gesture with strategic weight. When the head of state places himself physically among combat-capable assets, he performs three functions at once: legitimizing the force, taking visible ownership over its potential use, and signaling that civilian leadership is not abstracted from coercive instruments. In deterrence theory, this linkage matters. Rivals must believe that the political authority behind escalation has both visibility and grip, that decisions about force are not distant from the tools that would execute them. On that deck, the president was not conducting a cultural tour, he was verifying readiness in the domain that matters most, at sea, with the strike group intact and aligned to a war-credible posture. His presence collapses distance between elected authority and lethal capacity. The First Lady, senior defense leaders, and the Secretary of the Navy did not accompany him as observers, but as elements of the command policy spine. In military tradition, a review anchors accountability. The civilian authority inspects the force that ultimately answers to him. Intelligence services abroad treat such events as assurance that U.S. political leadership is visibly proximate to its instruments. Visibility modifies perception, and in security competition, perception modifies probability. Sea power enables a state to raise the clarity of its signal without raising violence. A carrier group can move through international waters without breaching sovereignty, present striking power without triggering engagement, and demonstrate reach without crossing borders. This is why navies have long been the tool of loud but lawful signaling. A warship's presence is not a declaration of intent to attack, it is a reminder of what could occur if deterrence fails. When the president reviews such a force at sea, the signal compounds. The force exists and the leadership aligns itself to its readiness. That coupling compresses ambiguity. It says that if conditions demand rapid action, the civilian chain is already attuned to the specific instrument that would do it. Naval deterrence succeeds not by fighting, but by convincing rivals that initiating a fight would fail. A high-level review is thus part of the deterrence cycle, showing that power is real, integrated, and governed, not hypothetical. Carrier Strike Group 10 is not a standalone object, but a node in a wider architecture of maritime power. Its mission is not simply to sail, it is to extend political influence beyond continental reach. In U.S. doctrine, carrier groups act as mobile enforcement of strategic promises, to allies, to treaties, to deterrence lines that have meaning only if a force exists to make them real. The aircraft aboard the USS George H. Bush are not aligned for public spectacle, but for immediate employment without dependence on land-based staging. The escorts, destroyers with layered missile defense, logistics platforms enabling endurance, and command vessels linking the group to joint force networks form an organism rather than a parade. This allows the state to operate at distance with continuity instead of short bursts. The president's review signals that this is not idle tonnage, but operational capability. In foreign defense circles, such visibility adjusts baselines. An inspected strike group implies that readiness is not paper doctrine, but live capacity. Credibility in power politics is not merely owning the asset, but proving it is integrated, disciplined, and politically backed. CSG-10 stands as proof that U.S. expeditionary leverage is not a relic but an active variable. To dismiss the event as ceremonial is to misunderstand the grammar of naval statecraft. Ceremony is the delivery vehicle. The message is the verified coupling of force and authority. Events of this kind are rarely aimed at domestic spectators. Foreign intelligence and military staffs watch them with forensic attention. When they see a fully assembled strike group inspected by the head of state, they do not file it under protocol. They place it under readiness and decision alignment. They ask why here, why now, why filmed, and why with essential command figures in frame. Such questions are operational, not symbolic. They lead to recalibration in simulations, in reaction timelines, and in assessments of U.S. willingness to mobilize. Even if no verbal warning is issued, rivals must assume that a force publicly validated is not strategically dormant. In competitive security environments, what matters is not what is declared, but what is implied about cost and risk. The message also travels to allies. Assurances are not kept by statements alone. When a head of state stands physically atop the platform that would enforce alliance commitments, paper promises convert into observable credibility. Coalitions do not strengthen on language, they strengthen on evidence that the guarantor remains capable and aligned. One of the defining features of mature deterrence is that it does not require an adversary to be named. Signals are structured so that those who need to recognize themselves in the message will do so without being invoked. A carrier strike group under presidential review is not a message to humanity in general. It is a message to any actor considering a test of limits. By avoiding explicit naming, the state preserves diplomatic flexibility while still imposing psychological cost. Rivals must assume that the deterrent applies to them even without direct reference. This form of signaling is efficient. It does not provoke counterstatements, does not trap opponents in public humiliation, and does not force a retaliatory declaration. Instead, it shifts the burden of imagination onto the observer, compelling foreign capitals to consider the consequences of misinterpreting U.S. posture. In deterrence, what restrains is not certainty of punishment, but uncertainty about how quickly and decisively it could be imposed. This is why the presidential presence matters. It narrows ambiguity on one side and expands it on the other. It signals that readiness is not merely institutional, but politically ratified. No doctrine must be read aloud, no escalation must be announced. The logic of risk shifts silently. Naval deterrence works not when an adversary retreats on camera, but when no challenge is initiated in the first place. The scene aboard the carrier also fits into a lineage rather than a moment. The United States has long used naval reviews as structured communication, from Roosevelt's review of the Great White Fleet to Cold War inspections of sea-based nuclear forces. Each instance entered the memory of other states as data, not ceremony. Over decades, a pattern formed. When the strategic environment tightens, the U.S. head of state realigns visibly with forward-projected force. Foreign analysts treat this continuity as predictive, not of war but of resolve. Thus, when the president stood on the USS George H. Bush, the moment did not float in isolation. It entered that ledger. It said that the link between authority and force remains intact. Those who archive such moments do not store them in cultural files, they integrate them into models of escalation probability, alliance reliability, and crisis behavior. In strategic competition, images are not decoration, they are parameters. What gives such events their weight is not the day on which they happen, but the continuity they affirm. A force unreviewed may or may not be anchored in authority. A force reviewed in public view is visibly tethered to decision power. Rivals do not look for speeches, they look for erosion. Erosion of coordination, erosion of civilian-military coupling, erosion of will. A review interrupts that suspicion. It states that the instruments of escalation have a present, accountable owner. States that think in strategic time do not treat these scenes as news clips. They convert them into inference. They recall which administrations placed themselves atop naval assets before major realignments, which did so before prolonged standoffs, and which avoided doing so before crises they mishandled. A single review does not predict conflict, but it alters the mental model through which potential conflict would be evaluated. Power projection is not merely the ability to strike, it is the ability to convince others that such ability is live, integrated, and politically backed at the moment of observation. That is the function of a head of state atop a carrier. He does not signal aggression, he removes doubt about activation authority. To those who monitor not rhetoric but readiness, that difference is material. A navy without political linkage is an asset in storage. A navy reviewed by its elected leader is an asset prepared under law. Seen through a casual lens, the sequence may register as a filmed appearance, a president on steel surrounded by salutes and ceremony. But through the lens of strategy, it is recognition that maritime force remains a primary channel through which the United States manages rivals, steadies allies, and prevents miscalculation before it matures into a crisis. Naval diplomacy works because it allows interpretation while eliminating uncertainty. No adversary must be named, no ultimatum must be spoken. The configuration itself is the message, a strike group intact, commanded, and acknowledged at the top of the chain. That image will circulate not only in public media, but in classified assessments, alliance briefings, and scenario planning. The day the president stood on the USS George H.W. Bush, the United States did not threaten, it reminded. It reminded that its expeditionary power is not theoretical, not ungoverned, and not out of political custody. In maritime statecraft, such reminders are structural safeguards, not against war, but against the misjudgments that cause one.